Hello and welcome back for another spell in the library. Do come in. Now, you may remember last time I just showed you a glimpse of the shelves, and I happened, randomly as it was, to pull out this lovely little book from my shelves, which is called England's Antiphon and is by George Macdonald, the great Scottish writer of children's fantasy and adult fantasy novels and wonderful theology, who was such an inspiration to Lewis and Tolkien. And this is a beautiful little collection that he put together of the English poetry that he loves, poetry that somehow he felt moves us to praise and devotion. And look who's on the cover there on the frontispiece. That's George Herbert, of course, and we'll hear a bit more about that later. And this was published in 1868, and this is the original first edition. So he was 44 when this came out. And I love to think of this book being in the world at the same time as its author, and perhaps he held in his hands a volume just like this. So make yourself at home, have a seat, and I'm going to just read you a couple of little extracts from this book, because although I pulled it randomly from the shelves, there's no random really, I pulled it randomly from the shelves last time. Looking at it again, I realised there's a passage in here which expresses exactly what I think these spells in the library might all be about. Here's a passage from the very beginning of England's Antiphon. He's talking about how when you go deep or high in your thoughts and feelings, you reach for poetry rather than prose. There's something of rhythm and music that has to come in. This is what Macdonald says. For song is the speech of feeling. Even the prose of emotion always wanders into the rhythmical. Hence, as well as for other reasons belonging to its nature, it is one chief mode in which men unite in praise of God. For in thus praising, they hold communion with each other, and the praise expands and grows. I love that idea that we hold communion with each other when we move into poetry. And he says it's not just when we're vocalizing it. He says this: when we read rejoicingly the true song speech of one of our singing brethren, we hold song worship with him and with all who have thus at any time shared in his feelings, even if he have passed centuries ago into the high countries of song. Well, Macdonald himself has passed into the high countries of song, and Herbert, whom we're going to read in a minute at Macdonald's selection, has too. But their speech and their music still reverberates with us, and we join in a kind of communion. And here's the way Macdonald puts it for this book. He says what he wants to do in this book. He writes, "My object is to erect, as it were, in this book, a little oracle or spot of concentrated hearing, where the hearts of my readers may listen and join in the song of their country's singing men and singing women. I will build it, if I may, like a chapel in the great church of England's worship, gathering the sounds of its never-ceasing choir, heart after heart lifting up itself in the music of speech, heart after heart responding across the ages. Hearing, we worship with them." That's exactly what I hope for our spells in the library. And just to give you a brief glimpse of how he does things, I'm going to turn to his chapter here on George Herbert. And he says this: "But with my hand on the lock, I shrink from opening the door. Here comes a poet indeed, and how am I to show him due honour? With his book humbly, doubtfully offered, with the ashes of the poems of his youth fluttering in the wind of his priestly garments, he crosses the threshold." There we are. George Herbert comes in. And he says, if in George Herbert there is poetry enough and to spare, it is the household bread of his being. So one of the poems that Macdonald selects is George Herbert's poem, The Flower. I won't give it to you all, but I'll just give you the little verse of The Flower that George Macdonald chose to quote, because it's about hunkering down. It's about having been in a kind of isolation, and about how Christ comes to Herbert and lifts him up out of it. So maybe it's something for our time. This is what Macdonald says before he quotes the verse. He says, listen to the pathos and simplicity of this one stanza from a poem Herbert calls The Flower. He has been in trouble. His times have been evil. He has felt a spiritual old age creeping upon him. But he is once more awake. Now here's the Herbert. And now, in age, I bud again. After so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain and relish versing. O my only light, it cannot be that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. I love that verse. I like to think that now also in age I relish versing, and it's got a special resonance for me because I had a magical day at Little Gidding where Herbert's poems were first sent to his friend Nicholas Ferrer. It was a day in which we'd invited Seamus Heaney to come and share with us. And I remember standing on the green sward outside the chapel, and Seamus Heaney, we talked about Herbert, and Seamus Heaney suddenly looked at me and quoted exactly these words that Macdonald's quoted. He looked at me and said in that rich, rolling Irish voice of his, now in age I bud again, after so many deaths I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain, and relish versing. And I'll never forget the relish with which Heaney said that. So thanks for joining me for a little spell in the library. Next time I'm going to reflect on the word spell itself, and I might pull one of my own books off the shelves, which are somewhere over there, my books, and read you a poem called Spell. So see you then.